Well, hello everybody from Scotland, down in Eagle Land, wherever you are in Eagle Land, and I'm going to be talking today about Greenland and passing through Iceland, both ways. Quite interesting dimension to that. But I always start this talk by saying sometimes I'm a bit of an obsessive about this, that I had for years wanted to go to Greenland. As I've said before, flying over, you see the most extraordinary. Flying east, flying west in the daytime, you see this most spectacular countryside, and depending on which line you take, you think, God, I must go there. And you meet people and you read articles in the climbing press, and you just sort of get things stirring up, and you think, hear stories of people flying in Twin Otter, Canadian bush planes from the north of Iceland across the Straits of Denmark to remote places in Greenland. And so I've always wanted to get there, and it took me a while to do so. And this is a story of a trip we made, a number of us. I remember struggling a bit. I remember putting it out in members to members in the Eagles to see if anybody was interested. And somebody else was saying, oh, you got to do this. And then David Wynne Jones came up in UKC asking for information. And I passed him on to somebody, a third party, who had given me both positive and negative, don't do this, etc. So it's been a bit of a homework chore and an interesting one, but it led to this trip, which I'm now going to talk about. And I'll share my screen. So there we are, Greenland. And the view, this is the view flying in. Obviously, it's a little bit lower, and you can see why the east coast of Greenland particularly is fascinating and why it's remote, because there's an awful lot of sea ice there that stays for a large part of the year. So there's just not a lot of access to the area. You have to fly in clearly. This is what's on the ground. When you fly everything, what's on the ground? Well, this is it. Sea, sky, ice, snow, and just a kind of, I don't know, there's no dust in the air, so you see further. And there's no sound, so everything sounds different. And it just is a kind of just wonderful magic place, which you just, and it just, I don't know, it just, you just could sit and look at the pictures or just sit there and just love it, because it was just so great. One of the great things about it is that you can fly from Edinburgh, Glasgow, London, Luton, wherever. You can fly to Iceland in a couple of hours and then stay overnight, and the next day you can fly a couple of hours, and then the next day after that you're actually in expedition conditions. You don't have to acclimatize, you don't have to trek in, you're in the snow right from sea level, and you're in big, very interesting mountains very quickly. And that was just the great thing about it. Somebody, I did a first aid course, Far From Help first aid course, and the doctor, who was one of the instructors, had been both to Liverpool Land and to Kulusuk area, and he just thought it was fantastic. And he had been on proper Himalayan expeditions and to places like Svalbard. He said, yeah, Greenland's the place to go. So there we are in full expedition conditions, in quite amazing terrain. The mountains are nice on the east coast, so they can be quite spectacular and quite steep, but there's a lot of good skiing in between them. So you get, I can't see my own screen here. Right, there we are. So you can get some steep skiing, as we did, in quite amazing terrain with lovely views. So you're skiing down, but there you are, another fjord, and then that's the Greenland ice cap. And if you want to walk for 2 or 3 weeks, you can cross the Greenland ice cap from there, which is quite extraordinary, just to be there and to see it. And there's some happy campers, Archie at the front there, constantly smiling, just being there, Thomas looking around attentively, and contemplative Chris at the back, just taking it in, skinning up in this quite extraordinary environment. This is the first morning. We woke up, and this is what we woke up to. So you can see mountains, a little bit stretched. It looks like somewhere this has been in Photoshop. And we were originally going to be going by dog sled and skidoo to our starting point, and then we were pulking in from there. But there's a change of plan. I'll explain a little bit later, and we ended up going in by boat. This is where we went into. So this is what I called imaginatively Iceberg Bay. So this is the kind of terrain we spent 9 days in 2 separate camps. This is the elephant in the Zoom. This is Matt Spenceley, who is the guide who owns the company Pirhuk, who has ski guiding, trek guiding, and now he's doing kayak guiding out of Kulusuk, and he now owns a couple of buildings there, as well as providing expedition access and logistics. Right, okay, so that's a little bit of a taster of some of the things. Greenland, as I say, was a kind of obsessive. This great big white thing on the map is the largest island in the world, 2 million kilometers square. 75% of which is ice cap, and it would be very bad news if and when it melts, because it will raise the sea level all around the world. But for the time being, it's, and there's fascinating science being done about that ice cap now with what's under it, partly because it's geologically North American. It's like the Laurentian Shield, the North American Shield, and therefore has lots of minerals in it. And the Danish government is putting a lot of money into Greenland, and they're sort of starting the clock ticking and saying, well, when Greenland, potentially independent Greenland, starts exploiting the minerals, they want payback. So it's something one wants to keep an eye on. I don't know what one can do about it, because it is concerning that it may well be overexploited. The local people call themselves hunters in their own language, and they are related to Inuit, but they don't like being called Inuit or Eskimos. Right, population in 2020 was 57,000 of the whole country. It's European, surprisingly, because Greenland is an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark. I don't know what Nicholas Sturgeon thinks about that. That's an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark. Right, there it is in its actual position, distorted, as we all know, by Mercator projection. So the further north anything is, the more stretched and bigger it looks. If you put it on the United States, it's about what it might look like, but you put it at the equator, it looks even smaller. And compared to Brazil, this is an interesting overlay here, this is comparing Greenland to India. So it's what, 65, 70%, something like that, of the area of India, and would reach from Kerala in the south right up and almost, well, up into the Chinese border and the Nepalese border. So it's a very, very big place with 57,000 people in it and a lot of snow and ice. As I said, I've had this long journey from somebody who'd been there. He said, oh, we got up in the morning and we didn't know whether to make a first ascent climbing or a first ascent skiing or a technical route or a plod. And I met this doctor on the course. There are other people. So there's been a lot of, I don't know, germination, as it were, which had me thinking about it for a long time. And as I said, I spoke to David and then read about their expedition with the dog. Greenland, Northeast Greenland National Park, if it was a country, would be the 30th largest in the world. So it's an incredibly huge place. Again, here, distorted slightly by Mercator projection again. But the interesting thing, as I said before, it's a couple of hours flight by prop jet from Reykjavik, and which is equally close to the UK. So you can get there reasonably quickly rather than being sick for 6 days in a boat to get to the Antarctic Peninsula, as I know some people have. Right. Okay, there is destinations. We had last year, we had a talk, if I remember, of people skiing from boats on this side of the island. I love the idea that there's a disco bay, but over there, and that Nuuk Airport is the capital. Nuuk is the capital, and there are jet flights, big jet flights from Copenhagen to get there. Up here is Constable Point. And this is where David, Wynne Jones, and Declan and co went up here in this part of the world. At Constable Point, which also has a native name, there's an airport which was built in 1985 by one of the American oil companies, because some of this land, although I'm talking about it being Canadian Shield and it being a nice rock, actually up here is sedimentary. It's Triassic sedimentary rock. So they were drilling for oil onshore. They didn't find any. And well, at least there's no exploitation. I don't think they keep quiet about it. So there's an airport there at an unlikely place, and you fly in. Last I checked, there's two flights a week on a Twin Otter. You fly in twice a week, and then there's the nearest inhabited place is actually a helicopter flight away. So there's a little helicopter taxi. But this is Scoresby Sund, the largest fjord in the world, I think, Liverpool Land, Jameson Land, the Stauning Alps. I made a list of all the different things that are in there. It's well exploited in reasonable terms because, again, because there's been an airport. And I think the Stauning Alps once had a hardcover guidebook that I had some time ago when I inherited some guidebooks from somebody. But this is where we went, is down here in Kulusuk, which is even closer and easier to get to from Reykjavik. Again, there's a bigger town. Kulusuk is, Cap Dan is the island. There was a native town there, but the Americans put in an air base because they had a distant early distant early warning station. And there's also, if you cross the Greenland ice cap from Nuuk to Kulusuk or the other way around, there is one of the navigation points is actually an abandoned radar station in the middle of the ice cap, which one time I found it had a webcam on it. So there's lots of stuff to do, not that far away, in a great big place. This was a full-on Scottish Mountaineering Club East Greenland Expedition 2003 to the Stauning Alps, making first ascents, sending their food out in the summer. So Jonathan Preston, who I worked with in the Alps a long time ago, was one of the people on this. This was a summer climbing expedition with funding from the Mount Everest expedition. So it was a proper expedition, full-on, completely independent. Previous Eagles trips, which if you can now go online and read some of these, there is the one that I was referring to, was 2013, Declan and David, and they were given the dog by the local people who they worked closely with. That's all very interesting, long report there. And there was the one that we saw, I'll just go on to the next slide. So there you are. So there was the one we saw last year in the talk with Andy, and then Bruce Goodlad was a guided group using Pirhuk, using a map out of Kulusuk, and then there's the Travels of the Dog. This is an interesting one. 2008, they were using Tangent, a company which has now gone out of business, I think, after COVID, and they used to take, that was bespoke aviation. They would fly you in and land with planes on ski planes. And I know somebody who went on one of those trips, and they said it was really at the end of your time when you've run out of food and you run out of energy and the plane comes to pick you up, there is a danger that it might not land, or it might land in the wrong way. And I think in this one, Tracy, the article, they did talk about having to dig the planes out both times, when they landed on their way in and they landed on their way out. And then Schweizerland, Al Powell is a guided trip, and just Simon Christie, Eastern Greenland. So there's a lot to read about if you want to get some background there, just by going online. This trip started in Iceland. It was planned to start in Iceland, but we stayed in Iceland longer than we'd planned because there was a big storm came in and the planes were not flying. And because it was a legacy, old-fashioned airline, they put you up in hotels. So our group, and I can remember there was one young Greenlandish woman with her baby. We were put up in this hotel, and we decided, well, we could go and see Reykjavik, which we duly did, which is a great place, and hired a car and went out to the Reykjanes Peninsula in the southwest of the island, where the volcano has gone off recently. But you can see there was a bit of a storm. It was not the kind of weather you'd want to be flying in. We were thinking, oh, great, they'll be dumping down. There'll be masses of fresh snow when we get there. But they went around the Reykjanes Peninsula, down in this part of the island, and you can see they make a lot of the geological factors that they have in Iceland, which is the meeting of North American and Asian plates. And there's all these places, more than one, where you can say, oh, that's North America on that side, and the other side is Asia. They're just cracks in the ground. It's not quite that precise, but it's all very interesting. And they've got boardwalks like this and viewing points when you can go and see these hot springs. So we did that to kill a few days before we're waiting. We went around and looked at the Blue Lagoon and didn't partake. It's actually industrial. It's the cooling ponds for an industrial a power plant, but somebody swam in it and, oh, we can make money out of this. And so they charge people a lot of money to sit in this warm water. Anyway, that was the end of our time, and the weather turned better, and we turned up at we pretend the airport, this is Reykjavik domestic airport, and quite surprised to see this many people, all with their hand luggage, some of whom wearing their ski boots, and everybody's going in the same place. And we thought, well, the plane isn't that big. Are we going to get all this luggage on? Are we all going to be able to fly? And we started chatting to folk. I mean, it's fewer people than you would have in an alpine hut in any night, and more people can get in the Agui de Midi cable car. So it was a bit of a surprise to see that many people. The guy, the baseball cap there, and was one of a party of 3 Norwegian guides on holiday, and they were really helpful in telling us where they were and weren't going, because Matt was already changing plans because of the weather. And then we texted him to say there's an awful lot of people, more people than we would have thought, and they were possibly all. There's one hut built by Danish lottery money, which you can't book, and if everybody was going to go there, it would have been a bit problematic. Again, just to remind you how short the flight is, so we took off, and there you fly, and you just get this spectacular views of the sea ice with the mountains rising out of them, and the mountains are steep and impressive, and you fly down low into them, passing icebergs on the way, and there you are. And surprisingly, you're actually not. You're south of the Arctic Circle. It's like the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula isn't actually below the Antarctic Circle, nor is these places. And I've been north of the Arctic Circle in northern Norway, where there's trees at sea level. But this is definitely very, very Arctic enough for me. Thank you very much, without the geographical distinctions. This is where we're going. So Cap Dan is Kulusuk is the island. Cap Dan is the wee town, although it's sometimes just now called Kulusuk. And there's the airport, and the Americans built a base, and they isolated themselves from the community, and they didn't want any contact with them to preserve the community, so that they're separated. But then they abandoned it, and I think the Americans sold or gave the air base to the local people. Okay, our plan A, was originally to go by, and some of this, of course, would be sea ice, the water, was to travel up here to this place called Tuno, the top, was to travel by dog sled for us and skidoo for the kit. And we were going to camp there and then go into the Schweitzer Alps, which were to the north, where there is this hut built with Danish lottery money. But there were a number of issues which came up, including the fact that the storm had dropped some rain at sea level, and then it had frozen, so that the ground was very, very hard. And they didn't think the dogs would be able to do 2-day trips. Their paws would be damaged by the very hard terrain. So there was rethinking about what we might do. This is where we would have camped in Tuno, and this is the Schweizerland area. You can see there's big mountains poking out of quite not that steep glaciers, so it might be great touring country, but it didn't look like it was great skiing country. In any case, we didn't go there. Later, more of that later. Right, here we are landing, Archie waving to us, and you can see how much snow has been put down, and you can see the kind of snow that it is, but you could skin up from the runway. Indeed, this bowl here, some people were calling runway couloir, and some people skied it at the end of our trip when we came back after our outing, main outing. There's the airport taxi waiting for those tourists, local people who wanted a ride into town, because we had to go into town. There was this building, which was, we were told that's a hostel for airport workers, but it was also an emergency hotel for when flights were canceled, and 3 or 4 days worth of flights of people sometimes had to end up staying there, which we did at the end of our trip, because we had a storm at the end as well at the beginning, but nothing in the middle, mercifully. So we walked into town. You can see where we're going. This is a stock shot of a polar bear. When we got into town that day, there was a polar, outside somebody's house, there was a polar bear skin hanging up to dry, and it had been shot that week previously near the airport. So from the time you land, you're aware of this objective danger, and rifles were carried. We walked into town, settled into one of these little cabins, and just looked at the scenery and had a beer, because it was the last one we'd have for a while. Get some sense of the culture. Of course, you can't dig. These are just mounds of where they've buried people, because there's no soil. And then you look across at that and you think probably from a base camp there, you could probably do a week's touring. I mean, these mountains are 400 and 500 meters from sea level. They're not huge, so you could do laps on them, but there's very interesting terrain just literally out of the door. This is the woman who is the local drummer, who they made a statue of. Right, sunset. Back to the house, even more sunset. And then the next morning we set off. So sadly, we're not going on the dog sleds, although we did have a little tourist trip at the end again on dog sleds, and I'll show you that later. It's not the most comfortable ride, to say the least. The boats seem to be being brought out for the first time that season because the ice was breaking up. But you think about what it would be like in a boat in that kind of ice, which is what we did. So we got in our boats with our pulks and all our gear, made our way through some of this ice, which was bang, 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 people standing up shouting, oh, it's over there, because it wasn't clear where we were going. But it all came good in the end, and then we were in open water for quite a while, actually a few hours up the fjord. So we get to this place, which I'm imagined to be calling Iceberg Bay, and you can see that this is as close as we're going to get to any kind of landing spot, which was fine. This is Thomas, who I think is with us tonight. This is just to show you how far we've come. So Iceberg Bay, this is later in the trip when we've gone further inland, further north, but that's Iceberg Way. So we put ashore there to go up here, eventually ski, but we have come from way down here in the boat that day to the edge of the ice. It's interesting, it's open there, but here it narrows down, and so that was as far north as we could go in the boats. Okay, so we've come from Cap Dan, Kulusuk, and we've come up here rather than going over here. Originally, we're now up in this part of the world, up here. And you can see where we've got the, that's the journey by boat. And then if you can see, sorry, and then you can see the two lines, which are the two pulk pulling days when we went to the first and then to the second camp. This is then Google Earth. I don't know why it's summer and winter in the same photograph. So that's at the iceberg, an Iceberg Bay, and we came ashore over here. First day we went up over this col and up this valley to ski, and then from that camp we skied. But one of the things we did ski was up this ridge to look up this valley to see what conditions were like, and then we moved around, traveling first by sea ice and then up into the further north. So here we are on the first day, getting ready to pull off. I don't know why I'm wearing my helmet. I think it's easier to wear than to carry it. And there we are setting off. And for some reason, I've been left behind and the others are charging on ahead. But I seem to have caught them up, or they waited for me. Anyway, it's one of these things. And I mean, I have had some experience of pulling things, and I wasn't looking forward to this, but actually it didn't seem to be too bad. And you're in such fantastic scenery. And skiing down with them, they're like a little wayward dog, because you're skiing down the same terrain you see us skiing up here. It's not that steep, so you had to figure out how you skied with them. But it was something I wasn't looking forward to, and it was fine. Here we are stopping for a bit of a break, my friend Andrew and Thomas, and we're going over this col. And I said, well, how do we know there's not a cliff over there? And the first answer was, we don't. The second answer was, we looked on Google. Well, they were just being a little bit of bravado, I suppose, but said, I think if you looked on Google, you'd see that it was clearly a way into where we wanted to go. The storm that kept us in Iceland longer than we had planned, we were thinking, oh God, one of the guests was American, one of the party was American. Oh, there'll be 3 feet of powder snow. Well, it didn't fall as powder snow, it fell as quite wet snow. And it actually brought down a lot of natural avalanches, which is quite concerning. But in fact, then, because you see the clear blue sky, it went cold. So everything froze again. And you had these strange runnels. And in fact, the snow was not difficult to ski. I don't remember thinking, oh, this is awful. But you look at it, and think, what's that? Is that it's incredibly dangerous? Well, it's all come down, it's all frozen, and it was quite safe. Just some of the views of all of the terrain that you had just looking out, sitting, eating your breakfast in the morning, just to see. You could spend a lot of time just going up and down that kind of slope. First camp, we built a wall, and
set ourselves up. One of the things we can't see there, you've got to take polar bear measures. So you put tripwire around. I think you can, no, maybe you can't even see them there. That's the first night. But there's a polar bear tripwire around that. So if a bear were to come in the night, he would set it off. But there had been an incident in Svalbard with the British Schools Exploration Society where it hadn't worked, or it didn't work quickly enough, and some poor lad was killed by a bear. So we did polar bear watch. We got up in the middle of the night and took shifts, looking out, keeping an eye out for the critters. Yeah, there you can see that pole there. That's one of the poles for. And the only incident we had was bang, bang, bang went off in the middle of the night, and somebody who'd been going to the toilet set it off. They had the gun, but we also had flares. So you were sitting with the flares ready to use them. So the first thing would be to fire a flare at the thing. Canada, everybody can get pepper spray easily, but there was no evidence of pepper spray, which is another anti-bear deterrent, but they don't seem to have it using Greenland. That's the first morning we woke up and the weather was not great. So we did some transceiver practice, digging practice, which is always sobering when you bury something 1.5 meters down and see how long it takes you to get it out. And we did crevasse rescue practice, just passing the time. And then the weather cleared. And because the days are long, we thought, well, we'll go up that's north facing. We thought, well, if we go up there, the other side might have turned to spring snow. So we duly did, and it hadn't. So the south side was not spring snow at all. So we skied back down the side we'd been up, and the weather started to close in a bit, relatively speaking. But after that, I think we barely saw a cloud in the sky. This is camping conditions. This is actually at our second camp, but we had a mess tent, which the food and everything was quite separate from the sleeping tent. So if animals were to come, they would probably go there. There's the rifle. We had 2 rifles, I think, if I remember correctly. There's us in the mess tent. So that's Matt Spenceley, the guide and organizer. There's me looking gormless. There's friend Archie, who's he's a fit lad. When COVID finished, he went to the first country he'd get to, which was Iceland, and just cycled around the island in about 3 days. There's Thomas, who I think is with us this evening, who lived in Scotland, now lives in north of England. And Andrew, my friend from London, who I've been climbing with for forever, since the 1980s. And Chris is a big wall climber from California, who does bareback riding and skiing when he's not up the rocks. And that's not a sleeping bear. Remember, there was the Owen Day trip, which in Canada, which was disrupted by waking grizzlies. Well, that isn't a sleeping bear. That's just a snow-covered boulder, which we communed with. So we often said, I'm just going out to talk to the bear. So that was our toilet facility at that camp. There we are, heading off. Rifle there, ready to go. And was it our first ascent? We're off to do it. And there's Thomas striding purposely up. And this amazing thing, there is no green, there is no brown. I've been at 6,000 meters up in a mountain, and you could see the glacier you're on and the mountain you're on. You could also see in the distance brown and green. This is nothing. You see the deep, you see the sea ice and the snow you're on. And again, as I say, there's no dust in the air and there's no sound. So striding up, looking all the time into the mountains where we might be going next. And this was one of these classic winter summits, ski summits. I mean, we could have gone to the top, but we only went to there. And even then, the skiing both up and down wasn't great, but it was partly to get a look down into this area of the world where we ended up camping later up here and going up this glacier, both from that day on one of our great days, which we did about 1,800 meters on the one day. Yeah, we are on that summit, and that's looking north into Schweizerland, which is the area I talked about. We were originally going to be going, where there are some quite steep mountains, going up to 2,000 meters. Where the area we were in, the mountains were in the first camp about 1,000, and the second 1,500. And a ski down on spring snow, which was great. And there wasn't quite enough time to do laps, but another place later in the trip we did do laps. And this is just the view from the tent when you wake up in the morning. Just wonderful. And then we decided to move on. We're actually on sea ice there, cutting a corner. The other side there has lots of possibilities. And I know Matt on his website has advertised trips over there. I don't know if they've run, speaking to Jim Blythe earlier this year in the spring, and he was about to go with Matt. And I think they were going to have 2 boats and cross and take themselves in each day, having a boat rather than being dropped off, and skiing in some of those areas on that side of the fjord. Oops, wrong way. Okay, there we are, moving camp again, going around the corner and going up. We got to a certain point. Matt said, oh, let's go up there. They'll get the sun. And of course, there's a sting in the tail pulling up this last, up to a nice sunny platform, which when we got there, we appreciated. But at the time, we thought, why are we doing this? Then from there, and you can see that's Iceberg Bay where we first came ashore. So we would have come along here, up to the right, camped, and then coming around to go up onto the mountains. And this was some of the most extraordinary terrain, that much higher, the weather crystal clear, these fantastic views down to the south and over to the west, over to the Greenland ice cap, whose various ways people are doing. It's too steep to skin for some people, some carrying, and I think some people did skin, persevered. Anyway, we're all there. I must say, complicated. You can try and do your forensic work. Who did what? Everybody still got their skis on. Some of them got skins on still. So some of them did ski and I carry. That's me there on the right. On the left, having carried Matt, Thomas, Archie, Chris, and Rich, who was Matt's IML. He had, the guides can take clients of 6, but he took one of his own staff as a client. So there was extra help. Technically. Then there's a ski down, which was fantastic and steep. And then we were at this camp, which was our last camp. And as I said, we went up to this call, Glacier Call, and went both ways and did 2 peaks around here. Both of them left and to the right from the call, 1,800 meter day. And then it's time to go home. So we made our way back 5 or 6 hours, pulling pulks, as I say, mostly downhill, level or downhill, back to where we carved out this space. And you can see the sea there. It's starting to turn to ice, because one of the dangers we had was that, of course, if it really froze, because we had high pressure and clear skies, that the fjord would freeze and we'd have to walk ski down to where the boats could get in. And the previous year, Matt had a bit of an epic when they'd done that, but there was water on top of the ice. And it was very, very wet and quite concentrating, potentially very dangerous. But fortunately, we were okay because the boats duly arrived. So there's the edge of the ice, but you can see it's glistening in the sun, and it is about to freeze. So the boats come in on time. Again, it's spectacular scenery the other side, which would well be worth a ski if you were taking a boat over there for each trip. And then this is the end, was fantastic because the sea, when we took off, even with the boat, the sound of the motor, you heard this crystal sound of the ice, because it was water, but it was ice, if you see what I mean, water with ice crystals, and it made this fantastic sound. It was a magnificent end to a fantastic trip in that wilderness. And not as rough as it was on our way out. And then we came back, woke up the next morning to a storm when we're stranded in Greenland. We can't do much. I have a vague memory of Thomas and I decided to go to the local trading post stroke store. And we went out in the blizzard and there was danger. We were, well, aside from, we didn't think there'd be polar bears out. We didn't think it's very far. It was quite interesting just walking out, and it's like going to school in Canada when I was a kid. So we were cabin stuck for a bit in one of these cabins that Matt has. He's now got a better one, caught up on sleep. And then the planes were all in the wrong place, so everything was out of schedule. And I think at one point there was a bunch of people got together and paid extra to fly on a Sunday flight, which wasn't scheduled. And some of us decided to put some money into the local economy and went out for a dog sled ride, which I can tell you was, one, uncomfortable just physically, no matter how much you padded out. And 2, the dogs are not house trained, so you've got to have your goggles on and be watching all the time for another objective danger. So between the bears and the dogs, there's things you have in Greenland you don't always have other places. And then from the airport hostel where they put us up, we had to get to the airport, but even getting to the airport was, we could have skinned, but we had all our stuff and no pulks anymore. And they had to get this critter out just to pull the van out to get to the airport, because again, there'd been more snow. So there's that blog, which has got, I think the link is up there, that if you want to read that, which I did a long time ago. And let's just end with a quote from Matt, our guide. "This is East Greenland to me. Immersion in something wilder, more beautiful and mysterious than I can possibly take in, whether that's out on some big expedition or 20 minutes offshore from home." And it really is quite a magical place. And the bonus is you get to do some wonderful skiing. That's me. That's in Canada, but that's me. Done. Thanks for your attention.
I went to exactly the same place this summer. So I'm literally going to take 5 minutes just to show you what it looks like. Exactly like Brent, our flight in from Iceland was delayed and our flight out from Iceland was delayed, but our trip, well, we had beautiful weather for 10 days. So having been delayed, we flew in on this day. The red arrow is Kulusuk, where we all land and start from. The orange arrow is where Brent actually went skiing. These mountains here, if you can see my arrow, is their original destination. And these red lines are part of the route that we then did in sea kayaks. This is what we were aiming to do. Again, Kulusuk at the bottom, orange arrow is where Matt was, and we were aiming to kayak up to these 2 big glaciers, which are kind of unpronounceable, where they drop down into the sea. And that's the trip we did, 10 days, camping wild. And that is one of those big glaciers where it comes down into the sea. Kulusuk in summer, very pretty if you photograph it from the right direction, and full of husky puppies, which were very sweet. We also used Pirhuk as a base. We didn't actually employ them as such, but Brent mentioned that there was a kind of a sub-guide in his group, Rich. Well, Rich's girlfriend is Erin, who's a friend of mine, and she's a sea kayak guide. And Erin convinced them to buy some kayaks and then promptly hired them to take herself and some friends on this particular trip. So we got the sea kayaks from the same people, Pirhuk. We're probably using exactly the same gun that Brent took up the mountains. And just to show you a little bit of what you can see in summer, the remains of the glaciers in the mountains. We were primarily there, or I was anyway, to paddle with icebergs, which sounded cool and it was amazing. They really are very beautiful. And it's really nice to be out on the water and able to get relatively close to them. Not too close, just in case they roll. Some of them are literally, truly deep blue. We had some days of just glass smooth water, these amazing reflections. We had some very big icebergs. This one was so big we could see it from the plane when we flew in, and then we found it in a fjord about a week later. And then this is up at our final destination, one of these big glaciers coming down into the sea, and then paddling in. Fairly close. They are carving, although not all that often. So you don't want to get too close in case they land on your head or capsize your kayak. It's a beautiful place in summer as well. And the same goes. It's actually pretty accessible flying in via Iceland. They take hiking groups out in the summer. A lot of climbers go out there. You can do easygoing ridge scrambling type of climbing, or I think there are a couple of sort of steeper walls with good rock where you can do more technical climbing. And yeah, you can get onto the glaciers in the summer as well, if you're looking for that kind of activity. Stuart Halford, you messaged me to say you've got some information about what's become of Tangent Expeditions.
Brilliant. Yeah, and thanks both of you for taking us on a winter and kind of summer trip to Greenland this evening. Fantastic, fascinating to listen to. And I speak as somebody who has got a bit of experience of Greenland. It's a great representation of winter and summer. Just a point, so Brent mentioned a couple of times Constable Point further north as a sort of stepping off point, the little airstrip for trips into Liverpool Land and the Storning Alps. And you mentioned Tangent Expeditions, and Brent, you're right to say Tangent isn't operating anymore. It is, but just under a different name. So during the whole COVID period, we restructured the business. So I work for the business. I'm not the business owner, but I work for the business, and we restructured it and renamed it GELCO, snappy name, Greenland Expedition Logistics Consultancy. So we're still there up at Constable Point as our in-country base, doing logistics support for people like ourselves on this webinar tonight, and scientific expeditions and filmmakers. So we're still there doing our thing.
Great. Thank you, Stuart. Do you want to pop a link into the chat to everybody as to where people could find you?
I will do that. Yeah, I'll make an apology for our website. We're still kind of morphing from one to the other, but I'll put an email address in the chat and the website address as well. Yeah, thank you.
That would be great. Thanks. Okay, so a couple of questions. I saw one from Kirsty. Kirsty, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, I maybe missed it, but I was wondering what time of year the winter trip was.
April, May. It was late season. Well, for us, if you see what I mean. It was April, May on the website. I just looked at my website. I can't remember the exact dates, but it was over the cusp of the end of April and the beginning of May.
Thanks.
The last 3 weeks of April, Brent. We
There's
came
Thomas
from the May Day bank holiday.
Okay, there you go. There you go. So we got May in. Right. Thank you very much. And Thomas in the chat reminded me that we did have some breakable crust. We did on one particular day, we managed this decision making and group thing. We managed the skin up a glacier was great, and we were in the shade, and we thought, oh, over there in the sun will be great on the way down. And when we set off to ski down it was spring snow for about one turn, and then it turned into breakable crust. And I think we ended up taking our skis off at one point, didn't we? Walking down through the breakable crust, it was like a nightmare. And then at the bottom, it was really icy. And oh God, it was, yeah, there was one particular descent which was less than ideal, but the rest of the time it wasn't one of those times. I mean, I've done a whole week in the Alps with breakable crust, you know, fantastic ascents, fantastic terrain, but the whole of the descents were breakable crust. But yes, there was a mixture of snow, and there was some spring snow, but it was a variety, and it was certainly worth doing. And there was, I think, probably as much steep terrain as I've had in any trip, in a general trip, you know, not when you're looking out couloirs, but just generally speaking, we had some interesting terrain.
Right. Any other questions from anybody? Declan, unmute yourself and go ahead.
Thanks, Cathy and Brent. That's really interesting. It's really interesting to see it both in summer and winter. Just Brent, the Pirhuk expeditions, they basically outfitted you with everything, with gas stoves, tents, etc. So it's readily accessible.
Yeah, I mean, even some of us had our own gear, but there were some of the people actually rented sleeping bags. They had right down to sleeping bags. I mean, some of us had 30-year-old, one guy had, I think, a 25, 30-year-old down sleeping bag that he had from the 1980s. So some of us had gear, others didn't. You know, the big wall climber guy, Chris from California, Nevada, Southwest United States, he didn't have a lot of that kind of gear.
Yeah.
So they provided even sleeping bags.
And just a question about access. I mean, originally you were intending to dog sled or snowmobile in, which probably would have been more uncomfortable. But was it unusual that they were able to use boats at that time of the year? Is that becoming the norm for actually?
Yeah, that's what happened. Was the storm that kept us in Iceland had come basically in the right direction to break up the ice in that fjord that we went up. So that was the first time the locals, Georg, his friend, local friend, they'd been out the day before and saw how far up the fjord they could get. So it was unusual. But as I said, I was with Jim Blythe in Iceland this spring, and he was about to go back home for a bit, and then he was going out with Matt from Kulusuk, and the expedition was going to have 2 boats for the whole week rather than just being dropped off. So I haven't seen Jim or spoken to him since, but because I think he's in South Georgia at the minute. But there was talk of going across that fjord to those mountains, which were on the other side, which looked quite interesting. And if you look on Matt's website, he's got them penciled in with lines on them as a potential steep skiing week based in that part of the world.
Yeah. And just on Constable Point, I know Tangent originally were flying in, but then laterally they were using snowmobile access. And when we went there, we used a local outfitters, Nanu Travel, or Nanu Expeditions, who were excellent for us. But again, we accessed via snowmobiles, which are very uncomfortable being towed along in the little sleds behind. But we did cover a lot of ground on sea ice, and if the sea ice had broken up, you know, I'm not sure we would have got to where we got to by boat. So that's interesting.
It's a tough call. I think Stuart was. I've seen some photographs of a friend who went with Tangent, and they had this wonderful cabin that was towed behind a snowmobile. It was completely luxurious with padded seats and that was covered. I think I'm right in saying.
Yeah, we have a few ways of transporting people behind snowmobiles, a pillion passenger. We have a thing that we laughingly call the banana boat, which is that kind of sled that goes behind the snowmobile, and you can kind of sit 4 people line astern. And then we have a thing we call the pod, which has got 4 seats in it, left, right, and then left, right again. I mean, we refer to that as the white hell, if I'm honest, because it has windows, but you can't see out because there's so much
because of the spray.
So yeah, you cover a lot of ground, but the better way to travel is directly behind the driver, with your sort of heated hand warmers to put your hands on and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, there's no easy way, basically. I mean, the boats are interesting, but of course, you're really at the mercy of they're all new objective dangers. We got in the boats, and the locals who were driving the boats had these survival suits on. We didn't have survival suits on. And we said, well, I said, don't worry, that's why we go in 2 boats, because the likelihood of both boats going down at the same time is small. But it is an issue, you know. And it was interesting too, because Matt told us the year before he'd had a broken leg with a client, and they'd had to have the client evacuated by snowmobile. They ended up phoning the Danish police with their sat phone, and they instituted a rescue. The helicopters fly on the island as taxis, both from Constable Point and Kulusuk Airport, but they're not set up as mountain rescue. So the easiest way was, in his case, that year they managed to get a skidoo in to evacuate somebody with quite a badly broken leg. So there is that transport. There's the variety. But I say skidoo's not wonderful. Dog sled. I'm interested to hear about the pod, because somebody I know, they quite liked it. But it's interesting that there's a whole challenge which exists nowhere else. How you're going to get in that terrain for the last little bit into the mountains.
is when we were there, Rich said to us that the dog sleds, the local people are subsistence hunters. They're not part of the tourism industry as well. They take people kind of along with them. They're basically mostly taking their dogs out hunting. And apparently had some tourists who ended up being very horrified as they got to watch and very close up as a seal got slaughtered and skinned in front of them, and they got taken back with the dogs and the half-dead seal. And yeah, so the dog sleds aren't there for the tourism industry. They're there for subsistence hunting.
Cathy, I would have a question if that's okay.
Yes.
That's Dave.
Dave,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah, hi Brent, really interesting to hear and see the pictures from that. There used to be a mountain hut in the area, the Tasiilaq Mountain Hut, which was used as a base a few years ago. Do you know if that's still there? Is that still being used by skiers?
There's that, yeah, there was, I think I remember when Al Powell of Alpine Guides, I think he took a group out, and I think it was actually an Eagle group. And I contacted him. I think it's on the shore somewhere. It's a hunter's hut, so they can extend their range. And that's where he went. And that I think is still there. But there's also this hut up in Switzerland, which
yes,
is
exactly. Yeah. Mm.
What Matt has done, he's built on the island, the Kulusuk island. He's built his own hut up at the end of the island. And I think you can see it on his website, and he's actually built it on skids, so it's pretty small. So you can actually move it, although I'm not sure how far you would want to move it. So he has his own hut. So he now has a lodge in Kulusuk, which is done up. I can show you pictures in a minute. And then so guests are basically being taken out like water skiers behind skidoos across the sea ice and skiing on the island in close. And they found some quite steep terrain as well. And can go around and stay in this wee hut. And there's a little video I'll show right at the end of that. So I think the hut that you're talking about, the one that Al Powell and company went to, and my understanding was that was still there, but it's right down by the sea and it's relatively low. It doesn't give quite as much opportunity for skiing. But it wasn't made as a mountain hut, it was made as a hunter's lodge.
Yes, not completely sure if that's the same place. I think the one I was meaning was further up in the mountains.
Well, there's the one
like
that,
day or two.
The one that the Danish doctor who was living in
could be, yes.
He got Danish lottery money and he built one in Switzerland.
Yes, I think it's that one I was thinking about.
It's 12 people.
Yeah,
but there's no booking system. When we saw those people at the airport and spoke to some of them, we thought it's going to be a nightmare if we all turn up there.
Yeah. Another question. You said you were using a perimeter wire around the camp for the polar bear. Did you have any watch overnight, or did you just rely on the trip wire?
It's funny because we had this list from Matt of things to bring, as you often do, and it was one of which was an alarm clock. And I thought, well, I've got an alarm clock on my watch, and everybody wakes up at the same time anyway, and I don't oversleep. Well, I thought, well, that's odd. But the reason for it was that we were on STAG, which is steer trained animal guard. It's usually soldier trained animal guard. Matt had been in the Marines, but one of the things that soldiers do is they get up in the middle of the night and they guard their camp and they take turns. So we did the same. So we had an alarm clock went off. You got up, middle-aged men. You would have been getting up anyway. You got up and you put on your expedition mitts, because again, he said, bring the warmest mitts you've got. So these big, long expedition gauntlets, which I've worn exactly half a day before in 20 years. And you put those on and you sat there with your Kindle or whatever else reading and scanning, and you'd look and there was no eyes, because you'd see their eyeballs if you had a little torch, and listen. And then we did that. So I think with Thomas, I can't remember, it was an hour and a half or something. It wasn't onerous in any way, shape, or form. It was actually part of the experience in a strange way, of the solitude and listening. You were listening because you could hear anything probably before you could see it, and in the dark. And it was fine. It was all part of the routine. But yes, we took that. And we had, if you were on bear duty, you had this flare gun, but you didn't have the rifle. The rifle was somewhere else. And we were instructed. A friend of mine went with the SMC on a trip, and they actually practiced They were unguided, they were self-guided. So they actually had a rifle. You have to take a rifle, it's required. And they actually did some target practice.
Yeah.
But Matt said, no, I don't want to waste bullets. But he told us if it does happen, you shoot the bear in the neck, upper chest in the neck,
Yeah.
try and hit
Yeah.
them in the head. But I think in all the years he's been going there, I think he's seen tracks or on the water, on flows.
Mhm.
But it's the kind of thing which would get in the newspapers and wouldn't do a terribly lot of good for your business.
No, or for your health.
Exactly.
But
Yeah.
for the clients, it was, I mean, somebody asked how cold it was. It was like -10, -15, which is fine. But once you sat there for an hour and a half, you get quite cold. So I remember it took me often a couple of hours to warm up again in my sleeping bag. And I had a decent sleeping bag, but still. So that's my main recollection. You just get frozen stiff on the bear watch. And I hadn't realized when I bought into the trip that that was going to happen.
Yes, we did the same in summer. We did bear watch. We did 2-hour shifts.
Yeah.
And rotated them. So you got a different one each night and then a night off. And they said it's based on the polar bear protocol from Svalbard. It's considered to be the safer than using the bear wires, which are actually really hard to set up properly.
Yeah, that's because the incident in Svalbard where the schoolboy died, Matt was saying the problem is they are difficult to set up. Professionals can set them up. But when it went off by accident, it was just a pop. It wouldn't have woken some people up. And it certainly wouldn't have scared a bear away. Whereas a flare gun fired in the right direction, in the right way, would probably scare an animal off or get them to pause significantly. I mean, another fear Matt had, he said, well, the worst case scenario for us is we come back having been up the hill and a bear has come up and trashed the camp. So like the tents have been destroyed by an animal who finds some food in the mess tent and looks for more food, and he destroys all of your tents. And then you're on the sat phone calling for the cavalry.
So there's a question from John. What temperatures were there at night and during the day?
I used to walk to school in Canada in -40. So I know cold. I didn't feel the cold. I was concerned because I had previously been in Nepal in -27 on a trek one year when the expeditions were all cancelled because of the cold weather. But I was concerned. I found it it was okay, temperate. But as Thomas said, the temperature did drop. And it's just a question of what you're used to. And there's no such thing as bad weather, they say, just good, bad clothing. I had a new down jacket. I'd retired my old duvet jacket. I had Primaloft trousers, which I can highly recommend. And I wore Paramo salopettes all the time, basically. I'd read somewhere an expedition somewhere in UKC, the guy said, just wear this stuff all the time, day and night, sleep in it, ski in it, climb in it. And then the Paramo over the Primaloft over the top trousers and a big new down jacket. And it was fine. And these expedition mitts. Thomas had some really interesting mitts. Do you want to tell him about your mitts, Thomas?
I never wore them. These are basically elbow length oven gloves. I thought it was a really good idea, but they all laughed at me, and I never got to use them, so never mind.
But it was interesting, and I've got if we've got some time, people still interested. And on the blog I have some observations generally about kit, and because some of us were using 25-year-old expedition gear, and some of us had bought new, and some were just using all new stuff. It was interesting, right down from what did you wear on your feet when you went to the toilet to putting your ski boots on in the morning in the tent, which is again a routine, and you get used to it, but it's just something you got to work out.
So the blog post that Brent is mentioning is in the chat if you want to find that link. And those Primaloft trousers are great. Erin was wearing them and I was utterly jealous and came back and promptly ordered them as soon as I got back. So Anna, you've got a question about duration. Do you want to come off mute and ask?
Okay, thanks. I think someone might have answered on the chat, but I'm really limited with time, but I love getting out to, middle of nowhere, and it looks beautiful. And I've been to Western Greenland, would love to go to Eastern Greenland, but, is it realistic to go, to go there and get anything done in 2.5 weeks? What would you think was the minimum amount of time? Because it sounds like there was delays getting out there for both the summer.
That's the problem, is the weather that makes the terrain what it is. In the winter time, of course, is, they just get a lot of maritime stormy weather. I mean, I've been looking on the websites recently, and on Windy, they're getting snow and blizzards now. So that's where you need your margin. You could get there. I mean, you fly to Reykjavik, to Keflavik, you get into Reykjavik, you fly the next day, you could be there. So you could be pulling pulks on day 3 if everything goes according to plan, but we weren't. And then you could stay out for however long you wanted to. You can ski now from Matt's Lodge in Kulusuk, or kayak from Kulusuk, and then you have to allow for the similar amount of time to get back. But everything happens as we had. You got if the plane is cancelled for 6 days, there's 6 plane loads of people waiting to get out, and some of those are local people who they prioritize, and some of whom have not terribly urgent but medical issues. They're flying to Reykjavik to go to the hospital. So it can be an issue. I know that there were, I think, Thomas, you went on the flight. There was an extra flight laid on, which some people paid extra money to fly, because some people, one guy was saying, it cost me, I lose £700 a day minimum income when I'm not working. I've got to get back to work. So they paid, and there was people flew out on a special unscheduled flight, but it was from the airline. It wasn't some cowboy in a prop plane. Well, they're all prop planes, but it was just contacting the airline to fly an extra day on a day that they wouldn't have flown. So it is a risk. You could go.
But Brent, is it not true that Matt now has this more permanent base in Kulusuk? So once you get to Kulusuk,
you can ski
quite a few things within a few days. So I think Anna's query can be answered that even if you allow for those uncertainties, you can still get a reasonable amount of stuff done within 2.5 weeks. That would be my guess.
Yeah, I would agree. So when Erin, who was kayaking with us, went out to visit Rich, that's exactly what they did. They day toured out of the lodge in Kulusuk. And then they did a couple of overnights using that hut you were talking about on the island that's just across the bay. And I think she only went out for 10 days. And you might get stormed in for some of that, but you've got a fair chance. They don't fly every day, but they do put on a flight on their off day if they've got people backed up in Kulusuk. Yeah. So Iceland Connect seems to be, have their system, because they know this happens and they've got to try and keep people moving. So I actually think it's probably one of the few places in Greenland where you could do a 2-week trip, have a pretty good chance. And if you get stormed in, their lodge is very nice. It's quite crowded. It's quite tight. Only 2 bathrooms, but it's not the worst place in the world to be, watching the storms howl outside. The only thing is they're only so big, and they do seem to book out pretty fast. You've probably got to book a trip with them at least a year in advance, and possibly more at this point.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I notice in the chat, Fan has mentioned these katabatic storms that they get off the ice cap. So you get a katabatic wind off the ice cap coming down, cold air descent, are just extraordinary. And you wouldn't be going out in one of those.
There's a question from Alex Fisher. Alex, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. It's a simple question, really, but I think when you opened up, you talked about different parts of the island being explored using kind of different mediums. I think you referenced possibly boats, and I wondered, is it possible to day tour from a boat around the island? Is there anyone that offers that as an option?
Yeah, Matt, the boats we went in were owned by Georg and his son. I've forgotten his son's name. They were locals and they used them for hunting, but they took us up the fjord. I'm pretty certain I've seen on social media now that Matt has his own boat. And so he could take you out in a boat. It really depends on the conditions of the ice and the time of the year, obviously. So sometimes of the year they would pull you behind a skidoo like water skiers. And then later in the year, that same area you'd have to cross by boat.
or sometimes in between you couldn't cross it at all because the ice had broken up, but it was still so thick. I was reading this book. You see, it's Exploring Greenland.
Yeah, funny enough, I bought that last week. Yeah, very good.
Yeah. Well, the first chapter in that starts in Kulusuk
Yes.
in 1991, and they were using local people, took them out in some fiberglass boats, making lots of noise as they went up to Switzerland.
Okay.
So there are the locals who will do it, but I'm pretty certain that Matt is advertising a trip with its own boats. I think that's the trip that Jim Blythe was going on.
Okay. Thanks.
Right. Stuart, you had your hand up at one point.
Yeah, it was just a bit more info for Anna and anybody else who's kind of considering a short trip. And I'd agree with everything that Brent said about the kind of randomness of Greenland aviation. But if you're planning a trip and kind of looking at schedules for aviation in Greenland, it will generally be radically different in the winter to what it is in the summer. So fewer flights, and that's often to do with there are fewer sort of scientific expeditions going out to Greenland. So there'll be less flying in the winter time to sort of layer into all the other problems of delayed flights and things like that. So don't consider a summer schedule that you might be looking at to be the same as what you'd expect in the winter if you're doing some planning. But yeah, short trips are feasible. You can almost start skiing out of as you climb down from the plane all up and down East Greenland. So.
Okay.
This is the new lodge that they've set up. So you can sit there with your binoculars and watch out the window. And this is a wee video. So it runs. It's got audio. Probably got music.
Yeah, you don't get audio if you have it embedded into your deck.
That's Matt's dog. He had two. He's only got one now. That's one of the boats. So it all flits by pretty quickly.
Yeah, it looks beautiful.
And there you are being towed behind a skidoo. There's the boat. And even a shot from a drone. So that's it. What else have I got there? Oh yeah, you can go with, if you have the money and the time, you can go with Jagged Globe and walk for 27 nights. Well, not walking for 27 nights across the Greenland ice cap from Kulusuk to Reykjavik. I can't remember which way they go. And what else? This is my next trip. No, it isn't, but it would be nice to be in the Arctic again. And this is Ross Hewitt. And this is the steep couloirs on Baffin Island between these amazing cliffs. And Ross Hewitt and I think Simon Christie were a place that guides go on holiday. I don't think anybody's yet offering guided holidays there, but that's a real destination. There you go.